I'm going to read chapters 7 through 9 because I haven't really read this week. So, My Ántonia by Willa Cather. Chapter 7. Much as I liked Ántonia, I hated a superior tone that she sometimes took with me. She was 4 years older than I, to be sure, and had seen more of the world, but I was a boy and she was a girl, and I resented her protecting manner. Before the autumn was over, she began to treat me more like an equal and defer to me in other things than reading lessons. This change came about from an adventure we had together. One day when I rode over to the Shimards, I found Ántonia starting off on foot to Russian Peter's house to borrow a spade Ambrosch needed. I offered to take her on the pony, and she got up behind me. There was been another black frost the night before, and the air was clear and heady as wine. Within a week, all the blooming roads had despoiled. Hundreds of miles of yellow sunflowers had transformed into brown, rattling berry snakes. We found Russian Peter digging his potatoes. We were glad to go in and get warm by his kitchen stove and to see his squashes and Christmas melons heaping in the storage room for winter. As we rode away with the spade, Ántonia suggested we stop in the prairie dogs and dig into one of the holes. We could find out whether they stand straight up or were horizontal like mole holes, whether they had underground connections where the owls had nests down there lined with feathers. We might get some puppies, or owl eggs, or snake skins. The dog town was spread out over perhaps 10 acres. The grass had been nibbled short, so the stretch was not shaggy and red like the surrounding country, but gray and velvety. The holes were several yards apart and were disposed with a good deal of regularity. It was as if the town had been laid out in streets and avenues. Almost always felt that an orderly and very sociable kind of life was going on there. I picketed Duke down in a drawer, and we went wandering about, looking for a hole that would be easy to dig. The dogs were out as usual, dozens of them sitting on their hind legs over the doors of their houses. As we approached, they barked, shook their tails at us, and scurried underground. Before the mountains of the holes were little patches of sand and gravel, scratched up, we suppose, from a long way below the surface. Here and there in the town, we came on larger gravel patches, several yards away from any hole. If the dog had scratched the sand up in excavating, how had they carried it so far? It was one of these gravel beds that I met my adventure. We were examining a big hole with 2 entrances. The burrows looped into the ground at a gentle angle, so that we can see where the 2 corridors united, and the floor was dusty from use, like a little highway over which traveled one. I was walking backwards in a crouching position when I heard Ántonia scream. She was standing behind me, standing opposite me, pointing behind me, and shouting something in Bohemian. I swirled around, and there was one of those big, dry gravel beds, was the biggest snake I've ever seen. He was sunning himself. After the cold night, he must have been asleep when Ántonia screamed. When I turned, he was lying in long, loose waves, like a letter W. He twitched and began to coil slowly. He was not merely a big snake. I thought he was a circus monstrosity. His abdominal muscularities, his lonesome, fluid motion somehow made me sick. He was as thick as my leg and looked as if milestones wouldn't crush the disgusting vanity out of him. He lifted his hideous little head and rattled. I didn't run because I didn't think of it. If my back had been against the stone wall, I couldn't have felt more cornered. I felt his coils tighten. How he would spring his length, I remembered. I ran up and drove at his head with my spade, struck him fairly across the neck, and in a minute he was all about my feet in a wavy loop. I struck down from height. Ántonia, barefoot as she was, ran up behind me. Even after I had pounded his ugly head flat, his body kept on coiling and winding, doubling and falling back on itself. I walked away and turned my back. I felt seasick. Ántonia came after me, crying, "Oh, Jimmy, he not bite you, you sure? Do not run when I say." What did you jabber Boheme for? You might have told me there was a snake behind me, I said petulantly. I know, I'm just awful, Jim. I'm so scared. She took my handkerchief from my pocket and tried to wet my face with it, but I snatched it away from her. I suppose I looked as sick as I felt. I never know you so brave, Jimmy, she went uncomfortably. You just like big mans. You wait for his head lift and then you go for him. Ain't you feel a little bit scared? Scared a bit? Now we take the snake home and show everybody. Nobody ain't see this in this country, so big snake like you kill. She went in this strain until I began to think that I had longed for this opportunity and held it with joy. Cautiously went back to Snake. He was still groping with his tail, turning up his ugly belly to the light. A faint, fetid smell came from him, and a thread of green goose oozed from his crushed head. Look, Tony, this is his poison, I said. I took a long piece of string from my pocket, and she lifted his head with a spade while I tried a noose around it. We pulled him out straight and measured him by my riding cord. He was about 5.5 feet long. He had 12 rattles, but they were broken off before they began to tamper, so I insisted that he had once been 24. I explained to Ántonia how this meant he was 24 years old and that he must have been here when white men first came, left on from buffalo and Indian times. As I turned him over, I began to feel proud of him, a kind of respect for his age and size. Seemed like the ancient eldest evil. Certainly, his kind had left horrible, unconscious memories in all the warm-blooded life. When we dragged him down into the drawer, Duke sprang off to the end of his tether and shivered all over. I wouldn't let us come near him. We decided that Ántonia should ride Duke home, and I would walk home. As we rode along slowly, her bare legs swinging against the pony's side, she kept shouting back to me about how astonished everyone would be. I followed with the spade over my shoulder, dragging my snake. Her exultation was contagious. The great land had never looked so big and free. If the red grass were full of rattlers, I was equal to all of them. Nevertheless, I stole various looks behind me now and then to see that no avenging snake, older and bigger than my quarry, was racing up from the rear. The sun had set when we reached our garden and went down the draw towards the house. Otto Funks was the first one we met. He was sitting on the edge of the cattle pool, having a quiet pipe before supper. Ántonia called him to come quick and look. He did not say anything for a minute, but scratched his head and turned the snake over with his boot. Where did you run into this beauty, Jim? Up in the dog town, I answered luckily. Kill myself? How come you have a weapon? Went to Russian Peter's to borrow a spade for Ambrosch. Otto shook the ashes out of his pipe and squatted down to count the rattlers. It was good luck you had a tool, he said cautiously. Gosh, I wouldn't want to do any business with this fellow myself. Until I had a fence post along, your grandmother's snake cane wouldn't do more than tickle him. He could stand right up and talk to you, he could. Did he fight hard? Ántonia broke in. He fought something awful. He is all over Jim's boots. I screamed for him to run, but he just hit the snake like he was crazy. Otto winked at me. After Ántonia rode on, he said, Got him in the head first crack, didn't you? That was just as well. He hung him up on the windmill, and I went down to the kitchen. I found Ántonia standing in the middle of the floor telling the story with a great detail of color. Subsequently, experiences with rattlers taught me that my first encounter was fortunate in circumstance. My big rattler was old and had lived too easy a life. There's not much fight in him. He probably lived there for years with a fat prairie dog for breakfast whenever he felt like it. Sheltered home, even an hour feathered bed perhaps, and he had forgotten that the world didn't owe rattlers a living. A snake of his size and fighting trim would be more than any boy could handle. So in reality, it was a mock adventure. The game was fixed for me by chance, as it probably had been for many dragon slayers. I had been adequately armed by a Russian Peter. The snake was old and lazy, and I had Ántonia beside me to appreciate and admire. That snake hung on our coral fence for several days. Some of the neighbors came to see it and agreed that I was the biggest rattler ever killed in those parts. This was enough for Ántonia. She liked me better from that time on, and she never took a super spirituals air with me again. I'd killed a big snake. I was now a big fella. End of chapter 7. I'm gonna read chapter 8 now. When the autumn color was growing pale on the grass in the cornfields, things went badly with our friends and the Russians. Peter told his troubles to Mrs. Sherrod. He was unable to meet a note which fell due on the 1st of November, had to pay an exorbitant bonus on renewing it, and had a mortgage on his pigs and horses and even his milk cow. His creditor was Wick Cudler, the mirrorless Black Hawk money lender, a man of evil, named through the country, of whom I shall have more to say later. Peter would give me no clear account of his interactions with Cutter. He only knew that he had first borrowed $200, then another $100, then $50, that each time a bonus was added to the principal, and the debt grew faster than any crop he planted. Now everything was plastered with mortgages. Soon after Peter renewed his note, Pavel strained himself lifting timber for a new barn and fell over among shavings, which, with such a gush of blood from the lungs that his fellow workmen thought he would die on the spot. They hauled him home and put him into bed, and there he lay, very ill indeed. Misfortune seemed to rattle like an evil bird on the roof of the log house, and to flap its wings there, warning humans away. The Russians had such bad luck that the people were afraid of them and liked to put them out of mind. One afternoon, Ántonia and her father came over to our house to get buttermilk, and lingered as they usually did until the sun was low. Just as they were leaving, Russian Peter drove up. Pavel was very bad, he said. He wanted to talk to Mrs. Sherrod and his daughter. He had come to fetch them. When Ántonia and her father got into a wagon, I entreated grandmother to let me go with them. I would gladly go without my supper. I would eat in the Sherrod's barn and run home in the morning. My plan must seem very foolish to her, but she was often large-minded about humoring the desires of other people. She asked Peter to wait a moment, and then she came back from the kitchen. She brought a bag of sandwiches and donuts for us. Mr. Sherrod and Peter were on the front seats, Ántonia and I in the straw bed behind, and ate our lunch as we bumped along. After the sun sank, a cold wind sprung and moaned over the prairie. If this turned into the weather had come sooner, I would not have gone away. We burrowed down the straw and curled up close together, watching the angry red dye of the west and stars beginning to shine in the clear, windy sky. Peter kept sighing and groaning. Tony whispered to me that he was afraid Gravel would never get well. He would lie still and did not talk. Up there, the stars grew magnificently bright. Though we'd come from such different parts of the world, in both of us there was some dusky superstition that those shining groups have their influence upon what it is and what is not to be. Perhaps Russian Peter came from far away than any of us had brought from his land too. Some such belief. The little house on the hillside was so much the color of night that you could not see in the way we came up the drop. The ruggy windows guided us. The lamp from the kitchen stove, for there was no lamp burning. We entered softly. The man in the wide bed seemed to be asleep, and Tony and I sat down on the bench by the wall and leaned our arms on the table in front of us. The firelight flickered on the hedge log that supported the thatch overhead. Pavel made a rasping sound when he breathed. He kept moaning. We waited. The wind shook the doors and the windows impatiently. It kept swept on against, singing through the big space, each gust as it bore down, rattling the planes and swelling off like the others. They made me think of defeated armies retreating up, or of ghosts who were trying desperately to get in for shelter, and then went moaning on. Presently, in one of those sobbing intervals between the blasts, the coyotes turned up with their winding howls. 1, 2, 3, and all together to tell us that the winter was coming. This sound brought an answer from the bed, a long complaining cry as if Pavel was having a bad dream or talking to some old misery. Peter listened, but did not stir. He was sitting on the floor by the kitchen stove. The coyotes broke out again. Yap, 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 yap! Then the high whine. Pavel called for something and struggled up on his elbows. He's scared of the wolves, Ántonia whispered to me. In his country, there are many, and they eat men and women. We'd sit closer together along the bench. I could not take my eyes off the man in bed. His shirt was hanging up, his embested chest covered with yellow bruises rose and fell horribly. He began to cough. Peter shuffled to his feet and caught up the tea kettle and mixed some hot water and whiskey. The sharp smell of spirits went through the room. Pavel snatched the cup and drank, then made Peter give him the bottle and slipped it under his pillow, grinding disagreeably, as if he had outwitted someone. His eyes followed Peter around the room with a contemptuous, unfriendly expression. It seemed to me that he despised him for being so simple and docile. Presently, Pavel began to talk to Mr. Schmidt, scarcely above a whisper. He was telling a long story as he went on. Ántonia took my hand under the table and held it tight. She leaned forward and strained her ears to hear him. He grew more and more excited and kept pointing out all around his bed as if there were things there and he wanted Mr. Schmidt to see them. It's wolves, Jimmy, Ántonia whispered. It's awful what he says. The sick man raged, shook his fist, seemed to be cursing people who had wronged him. Mr. Schmidt caught him by the shoulder, but could hardly hold him in bed. At last he was shut off by a coughing fit, which fairly choked him. He pulled a cloak from under his pillow and held it to his mouth. Quickly it was spotted with red blood spots. I thought I would never see any blood so bright. When he lay down and turned his face to the wall, all the rage had gone out of him. He lay patiently fighting for the breath, like a child with croup. Antonia's father uncovered one of his long, bony legs and rubbed it rhythmically. From our bench, we could see what a hollow case his body was. His spine and shoulders blades stood out like the bones under the hind of a dead steer left in the fields. That sharp backbone must have really hurt him when he laid on it. Gradually, relief came to all of us. Wherever it was, the worst was over. Mr. Schmid signed to us that Pavel was asleep. Without a word, Peter got up and lifted his lantern. He was going out to get his team to drive us home. Mr. Schmid went with him. We sat and watched the long boat head back under the blue sheets, scarcely daring to breathe. On the way back, we were laying in the straw. Under the jolting and rattling, Ántonia told me as much of the story as she could. What she did not tell me then, she told later. We talked of nothing else for days afterwards. When Pavel and Peter were young men, living in home in Russia, they were asked to be groomsmen for a friend who was marrying the belle of another village. It was the dead of winter, and the groom's party went over to the wedding in sleds. Peter and Pavel drove in the groom's sled. 6 sleds followed with all his relatives and friends. After the ceremony at the church, the party went to a dinner begun by the parents of the bride. The dinner lasted all afternoon, then became supper and continued far into the night. There was much dancing and drinking. At midnight, the parents of the bride said goodbye and blessed her. The groom took her up in his arms and carried her out to his sled and tucked her under the blankets. He sprang in beside her, and Pavel, Pavel, took the front seats. Pavel drove. The party set out, with singing and the jingle of sled bells. The groom's sled going first. All the drivers went more or less the worse for merrymaking, and the groom was absorbed in his bride. The wolves were bad that winter. Everyone knew it, and yet when they first heard the first wolf cry, the drivers were not much alarmed. They had too much good food and drink inside them. The first howls were taken up and echoed with quickened repetitions. The wolves were coming together. There was no moon, but the starlight was clear on the snow. A black drove came up over the hill behind the wedding party. The wolves ran like streaks of shadow. They looked no bigger than dogs, but there were hundreds of them. Something happened to the hindmost sledge. The driver lost control. He was probably very drunk. The horses left the road. The sled caught in a clump of trees and overturned. The occupants rolled out over the snow. The fleece of the wolves sprang up upon them. The shrieks that followed made everyone sober. The drivers stood up and lashed their horses. The groom had the best team, and his sled was lightest. All the people carried from 6 to a dozen people. Another drove or lost control. The screams of the horses were more terrifying to hear than the cries of the men and women. Nothing seemed to check the wolves. It was hard to tell what was happening in the rear. The people who were falling behind shrieked as pitifully as those who were already lost. The little bride hid her face in the groom's shoulder and sobered. Pavel sat still and watched his horses. The road was clear and white. The groom's 3 blacks went with the wind. It was only necessary to be calm and to guide them carefully. At length, as they breasted a long hill, Peter rose cautiously and looked back. "There are only 3 sleds left," he whispered. "And the wolves?" Peter asked. Enough for all of us." Pavel reached the brow of the hill, but only 2 sleds followed him down the other side. In that moment, on the hilltop, they saw behind them a swirling black group on the snow. Presently, the groom screamed. He saw his father's sled overturned with his mother and sister. He sprang up as if he meant to jump, but the girl shrieked and held him back. It was even then too late. The black ground shadows were already crawling over the heaps in the road, and one horse ran across the fields, his harness hanging on him, the wolves at his head. But the groom's movement had given Pavel an idea. They were within a few miles of their village now. The only sledge left out of 6 was not very far behind them, and Pavel's middle horse was failing. Besides, a frozen pond, something happened at the other sledge. Peter saw it painfully. 3 big wolves got abreast of the horse, and the horses went crazy. They tried to jump over each other, got tangled in the harness, and overturned the sled. When the shriekings behind them died away, Pavel realized he was alone upon the familiar road. "They still come?" he asked Peter. "Yes." "How many?" 20, 30. Enough. Now his middle horse being almost dragged by the other 2, Pavel gave Peter the reins and stepped carefully into the back of the sled. He called to the groom that they must lighten and pointed to the bride. The young man cursed him and held her tight. Pavel tried to drag her away in the struggle. The groom rose. Pavel knocked him over into the side of the sled and threw the girl after him. He said he never remembered exactly how he did it or what happened afterwards. Peter, crouching in the front seat, saw nothing. The first thing either of them noticed was a new sound that broke into clear air, louder than they had ever heard it before. The bells of the monstrosity of their own town rang for early prayers. Pavel and Peter drove into the village alone, and they had been alone ever since. They were run out of their village. Pavel's own mother would not look at him. They went away to strange towns, but when Peter learned where they came from, they were always asked if they knew the 2 men who'd fed the bride to the wolves. Wherever they went, the story followed them. It took them almost 5 years to save money enough to come to America. They worked in Chicago, then Mons, Fort Wayne, but they were always unfortunate. When Pavel's health grew so bad, they decided to try farming. Pavel died a few days after he had burned his mine since their Schmed. He was buried in the Norwegian graveyard. Peter sold off everything and left the country, went to be cook in a railway construction camp where gangs of Russians were employed. At a sale, we bought Peter's wheelbarrow and some of his harness. During the auction, we went about with his head down and never lifted his eyes. He seemed not to care about anything. The Black Hawk moneylender who held mortgages on Peter's livestock was there. He bought in the sale notes at about 50 cents on the dollar. Everyone said Peter kissed the cow before she fled, was led away with her new owner. I did not see him do it, but this I know. After all, his furniture and his cook stove and pots and pans had been hauled off by the purchasers. When his house was stripped and bare, he sat down on the floor with his clasp knife and ate all the melons I'd put away for winter. When Mr. Schmidt and Kursk drove up in the wagon to take Peter to the train, they found him with a dripping beard surrounded by heaps of melon ripes. The loss of his two friends had a depressing effect upon Mr. Schmidt. When he was out hunting, he used to go into the empty log house and sat there brooding. This cabin was his hermitage until the winter snow penned him in his cave. For Ántonia and me, the story of the wedding party was never at end. We did not tell Pavel's secret to anyone, but guarded it jealously, as if the wolves of the Ukraine had gathered that night long ago, and the wedding party had been sacrificed to give us a painful and spectacular pleasure. At night before I went to sleep, I often found myself in a sledge drawn by 3 horses, dashing through a country that looked something like Nebraska, something like Virginia. Chapter 9. The first snowfall came early in December. I remember how the world looked from our sitting room window. As I dressed behind the stove that morning, the low sky was like a sheet of metal. The blonde cornfield had fell out into ghostliness at last. The little pond was frozen under its stiff willow branches. Big white flakes were swirling over everything, disappearing in the red grass. Beyond the pond, on the hill that climbed to the cornfield, there was faint marks in the grass, a great circle where the Indians used to ride. Jake and Otto were sure that when they galloped around that ring, the Indians tormented prisoners bound to a stake in the center, but Grandfather thought they were merely ran races or trained horses there. Whenever one looked at the slope again, the setting sun, the circle showed like a pattern in the grass, and this morning, when the first light spring of snow laid over it, it came out with wonderful distinctness, like strokes of Chinese white on canvas. The old figure stirred me as it had never done before, and seemed a good omen for the winter. As soon as the snow had packed hard, I began to drive about the country in a clumsy sled that Otto Funks made for me by fastening a wooden goods box on bobs. Funks had been apprenticed to a cabinet maker in the old country, and was very handy with tools. He would have done a better job if I hadn't hired him. My first trip to the post office, and the next day I went over to take Jolka and Ántonia for a sled ride. It was a bright, cold day. I piled straw and buffalo robes into the box and took 2 hot bricks wrapped in old blankets. When I got to Shermad's, I did not go into the house, but sat in my sled at the bottom of the drawer and called. Ántonia and Jolka came running out, wearing little rabbit-skin hats their father had made for them. They had heard about my sled from Ambrosch and knew why I'd come. They tumbled in beside me, and we went off towards the north, along a road that happened to be broken. The sky was brilliantly blue, and the sunlight on the glittering white stretch of prairie was almost blinding. As Ántonia said, the whole world was changing by the snow. We kept looking in vain for familiar landmarks. The old arroyo, through which Squeak Creek wound, was now only a cleft between snow drift, very blue when one looked down into it. The treetops that had been gold all autumn were dwarfed and dwindling, as if we would never have any life in it again. The little settlers, which were so dull and dingy before, now stood out a strong dusky green. The wind had the bearing state of fresh snow. My throat and nostrils smarted as if someone had opened a hardened bottle. The cold stung, and at the same time delighted one. My horse's breath rose like steam, and wherever we stood, he smoked all over. The cornfields got back a little on their color under the dazzling light, and stood the palest possible gold in the sun and snow. All about us the snow was crumbled, in shadowed terraces, like tracing with ripple marks at the edge. The curvy waves were exactly impressions of the lashing lash in the winds. The girls had a cotton dress under their shawls. They kept shivering beneath the buffalo robes and hugged each other for warmth. But they were so glad to get away from their ugly cave and their mother's scolding that they begged me to go on and on as far as Russian Peter's house. The great fresh open after this thawing warmth indoors made them have this like wild things. They laughed and shouted and said they never wanted to go home again. Couldn't we settle down and live in Russian Peter's house? Jacques asked. And couldn't I go into town and buy things for us to keep house with? All the way to Russian Peter's, we were extravagantly happy. But when we turned back, it must have been about 4 o'clock. The east-west wind grew stronger and began to howl. The sun lost its hardening power, and the sky became angry and somber. I took my long wooden comforter and wound it again round Joka's throat. She got so cold that we made her hide her head under the buffalo robe. Ántonia and I sat erect. I held the reins clumsily, and my eyes were blinded by the wind a good deal of the time. It was growing dark when we got to their house, but I refused to go in with them and get warm. I knew my hands would ache terribly if I went near a fire. Joka forgot to give me back my comforter, and I had to drive home directly against the wind. The next day came down with an attack of the quimsies, which kept me in the house for nearly 2 weeks. The basement kitchen seemed heavenly safe and warm in those days, like a tight little boat in a winter sea. The men were out in the fields all day, husking corn, and when they came at noon, with long caps pulled down over their ears and their faces and red lines over shoes, I used to think like they were Arctic explorers. In the afternoon, when grandmother sat upstairs darning or making husky gloves, I read The Swiss Family Robinson aloud to her, and I felt that the Swiss family had no advantages over us in the way of an adventurous life. I was convinced that man's strongest antagonist is the cold. I admired the cheerful zest in which grandmother went about keeping us warm and comfortable and well fed. She often reminded me, when she was preparing for the return of the hungry men, that this country was not like Virginia, and that here a cook had, as she said, very little to do with. On Sunday she gave us as much chicken as we could eat, and on the other days we had ham or bacon or sausage meat. She baked either pies or cakes for every day, and thus for a change she made my favorite pudding, dripped with currants and boiled in a bag. Next to getting warm and keeping warm, dinner and supper were the most interesting things we had to think about. Our lives centered around warmth and food and the return of the men at nightfall. I used to wonder, when they came in tired from the fields, their feet numb and their hands cracked and sore, how they could do all the chores so concisely: feed and water the bed of the horse, milk the cows, and look after the pigs. When supper was over, it took them a long while to get the cold out of their bones. While grandmother and I washed the dishes, grandfather read his paper upstairs. Jake and Otto sat on the long bench behind the stove, using their inside boots or rubbing model toes in their cracked hands. Every Saturday night we popped corn or made taffy, and Otto used to sing, "For I am a cowboy and know I've done wrong," or "Bury me not like the lone prairie." He had a good neat voice, and always loved to sing when we went to church services at the sod schoolhouse. I had seen those two men sitting on the bench, Otto's close clipping head and Jake's shaggy hair sticking flat in front by a wet comb. I could see the sag of their tired shoulders against the whitewashed walls. What good fellows they were! How much they knew and how much things they had faced with. Funks had been a cowboy, a stage driver, a bartender, a miner, had wandered all over the great western country and done hard work everywhere. Though, as grandmother said, he had nothing to show for it. Jake was duller than Otto. He He could scarcely wrote even his name with difficulty. And he had a violent temper which sometimes made him behave like a crazy man, tore him all over into pieces, and actually made him ill. But he was so soft-hearted that everyone could impose upon him if he, as he said, forgot himself, and swore before grandmother. He went about depressed and shameful east all day. They were both of them jovial about the cold in the winter and the heat in summer. Always ready to work overtime to meet emergencies, it was a matter of pride with them, not to spare themselves. Yet they were sort of men who never got on somehow or do anything but work hard for $1 or $2 a day. On those bitter starlight nights, as we sat around the old stove that fed us and warmed us and kept us cheerful, we could hear the coyotes howling down by the corral, and their hungry, wintry cries used to remind the boys of wonderful animal stories about gray wolves and bears in the Rockies, wild cats and panthers in the Virginia mountains. Sometimes Funks could be persuaded to talk about the outlaws and desperate characters he had known. I remember one funny story about him that made grandmother, who was working her bed on the breadboard, laugh until she wiped her arms with her bare arms. Her hands were being floured. It was like this. When Otto left Australia to come to America, he was asked by one of his relatives to look after a woman who was crossing on the same boat to join her husband in Chicago. The woman started off with 2 children, but it was clear her family might grow larger on the journey. Funk said he got on fine with the kids, and like the other mother, thought he played a sorry trick on him. In Middle Ocean, she proceeded to have not just 1 baby, but 3. This event made Funks the object of undeserved novelty since he was traveling with her. The steerage steward was indignant with him. The doctor regarded him with suspicion. The first cabinet passenger, he had made up a purse for the woman, took an embarrassing interest in Otto's, and often inquired him about his charge. When the triplets were taken ashore to New York, he had, as he said, to carry some of them. The trip to Chicago had been even worse than the ocean voyage. On the train, it was very difficult to get milk for the babies and to keep their bottles clean. The mother did her best, but no woman of her natural resources can feed 3 babies. The husband in Chicago was working in a furniture factory for a modest wage, and when he met his family at the station, he was rather crushed by the size of it. He too seemed to consider Funks in some fashion to blame. I was sure glad, Otto's concluded, that he didn't take his hard feelings out on the poor woman, but he had soul and eyes for me, all right. Now, did you ever hear of a young feller have such hard luck, Miss Burden? Grandmother told him that she was sure the Lord remembered these things to his credit and had helped him out of many scrapes when he didn't realize that he was being protected by Providence. Sorry about my voice and stuff at the end. Kind of tired and need water after drinking and reading that much. But that was chapters 7, 8, and 9. 7, 8, y 9 of My Ántonia by Willa Cather. Please like, subscribe, comment, and check out my channel for more chapters of My Ántonia. Sorry I didn't really post the last few days. I was doing stuff, had a life, had to help friends out, and yeah, that last part was funny because not like I have friends. We're gonna make this online. Yeah, I'm not gonna record it out. Not that people watch this, but yeah, sorry I didn't post the last few days. But I will try to post regularly from now on. Bye bye!